Hello, my name is Miguel Neves, and I am the editor-in-chief of EventMB, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the Event Manager podcast. We are joined by Elliot Ferguson, the president and CEO of Destination DC, and we're talking about why diversity in the event industry really matters. We talk about the evolving role of destination marketing organizations. We talk about how planners are now assessing destination in terms of sustainability, as well as diversity and inclusion. We talk about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DI, in the event industry. We talk about how we can help make the event industry a more diverse and inclusive place. And we also talk about the best ways to inspire young professionals to be part of this amazing industry. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Event Manager podcast, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe even leave a review. Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Event Manager podcast. I am joined by Elliot Ferguson, the president and CEO of Destination DC. Elliot, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Miguel, thanks for having me.
For those of anybody out there who doesn't know who you are, could you give us a little intro about your role and maybe kind of how you got there in a succinct way?
Sure. I'll spend the next 60 minutes talking about myself. No. Well, again, I work for Destination DC, which is a destination management organization for Washington. We do represent Maryland and Virginia, but it's mostly DC first. I've been in the industry for 30 years, and I've been with Destination DC for 20 years and been CEO for about 12 of those years. Really focusing on all things tied to economic development through tourism, hospitality, and conventions and meetings.
Fantastic. And what was your role before that, if you don't mind me asking that? The 10 years previous, what was your path?
I spent 10 years with the Atlanta Convention and Visitors Bureau, starting off in citywide convention sales, leaving as vice president. And I really need to start, it's actually now 32 years, because I spent 2 years in Savannah with the Convention and Visitors Bureau there in sales, a small town in Georgia that has a really amazing story to tell and a great destination.
Great. So you're definitely an expert when it comes to DMOs and all that side of the business. So I really wanted to start there. I think, the pandemic is something we can't avoid, and I don't want to make this whole episode about the pandemic, but I'm really interested in your view about how the pandemic has maybe changed the role of DMOs, or maybe it hasn't. But I know that, you've told me before that if I ask you one thing 1 week during the pandemic, it might be different from the next week. And how does that really affected how you do business and how you really market a destination?
Well, what I said before still stays the same in terms of the changing dynamics of our world and of course, the pandemic and how it affects our ability to do our jobs. I think the reality is, as the thing that there's nothing good about the pandemic. Let me start off by saying that. However, as we look at destinations globally, now more than ever, cities, states recognize the importance of destination management organizations representing their destinations in a variety of ways. And I think that no matter how great a DMO is, there's always going to be someone within that city that says, hey, we don't want visitors, or why do we need to promote ourselves because our destinations are great and people just automatically want to come here. So I think the level of understanding as to the role of a DMO has changed. I think as we look at doing our jobs, it's become equally as much to share information about how we're going to keep people safe. What's the protocol in terms of individuals coming for leisure travel, for business travel, since we're still dealing with variants that continue to still come and affect the way in which we do business. We're saying to our stakeholders, absolutely tell anyone that's interested in your hotel how great your suite is, but equally as much, make sure they have a better understanding of the protocol tied to safety for your staff, and of course the cleaning standards for those rooms, which is really going to resonate now probably more than pre the pandemic.
Do you find that it's falling more on DMOs like yourself to kind of navigate the the sort of deal-breaking sales conversations, whereas it might have previously been more around venues or, you know, the discussions around particular properties?
Yeah, I think that, you know,
Are you more
DMO,
gatekeeping it, I guess, is the question?
you know, I would say that we, in our minds, we've always been in that role. I mean, you know, we're selling the destination, not necessarily a particular hotel, and that still remains the case. You know, when DC was closed during the spring, you know, there were a lot of questions that were that were positioned to us in terms of why is DC still closed when other parts of the U.S. were opening. And, you know, so that's always been somewhat the case. I think, again, now, not only is the city using us to a certain extent to disseminate information about DC, safety protocol, et cetera, but the expectation from visitors, from groups that are coming to the city is that, you know, let's reach out to the DMO, let's go to their website and find out what's the latest. And it's our responsibility to share with them what that protocol is and or what those standards are before they physically come to the city.
How do you navigate those conversations as a DMO? I mean, I assume that, you know, there are people who are fixed on doing on some events in DC, events that rely on DC's intellectual capital. Meanwhile, they're frustrated by the fact that, you know, you might have stricter regulations than in other areas. Do you just try to defer that business down the line, or how does that work?
You know, being brutally honest really helps. I mean, the reality is right now, the criteria for coming into DC, meeting in DC is similar to a lot of the places everywhere nationwide in the US, as well as in other global destinations. Wear a mask. There is a mask mandate. The criteria for vaccinations, that continues to change, whereas, you know, now there are certain restaurants in DC that require proof of vaccination. You know, we all know that cities like New York and San Francisco require vaccination or proof of vaccination as you're vacillating through the city for retail and other components of being in that destination. And that's probably going to resonate as cities like Washington and really global cities continue to focus on not only the current variant that's out there, but others, as well as the fact that we're still focusing on people taking the vaccination, getting vaccinated. So that's the other thing we're doing more of. We're if you go to washington.org, you'll see information about where you can get vaccinated in DC, or a link to show you where you can get vaccinated by putting in your zip code as to wherever you are in the United States, because we want to make sure that people are taking that seriously, and we want to do the best we possibly can.
That's fascinating. Wanted to touch on a little bit the planner side. You know, are you seeing a different sort of profile for planners now? I was speaking with Greg Oates, I think you know well as well, recently, he's saying that planners are now really asking for things like sustainability and DEI. Are you seeing that? Is there a difference in the people that are coming to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sustainability has been a topic for at least the last 5 years. I think, you know, people have asked, it depends on the group. You know, different people would ask questions about DEI, especially those that represent a more diverse portion of the population. But now, I think, especially since last year in America and globally, that has become a priority. You know, are you making diversity, equity, and inclusion a priority? Are you also focusing on the needs of those with handicaps and or that are physically challenged? So that has been something that we focused on as an organization. But even with what's happened as of recent months, we've even elevated what we've done in the past, simply because we want to talk about the successes in which we've had as an organization as we look at promoting our destination and our members. So it has become something that is a deal breaker in some cases, especially with meeting planners.
So you're actually seeing people make decisions based on these kind of things rather than, I guess, price or kind of more logistics-based things?
Yeah, the boards of directors for any organization, and usually the nonprofits that report to a board of directors, they're more sensitive to issues that impact their members. You know, be it, you know, I remember years and years ago in Arizona when they were the last state to pass the Dr. Martin Luther King junior holiday, there were folks that responded in kind and said we weren't going to Arizona. So as groups are looking at destinations, by all means, cost remain a big concern of theirs, but also what are the other dynamics of that community that are linked to their membership, and or as we're asking organizations or challenging organizations to explore how diverse they are, they're now in turn asking the same questions of destinations, and rightfully so.
Interesting. And what about in the event industry or in the wider hospitality industry? I know you're one of the few professionals, Black professionals in kind of leadership roles, and also you're the chairman of the board for Tourism Diversity Matters, I believe. Have you seen things change, and is it improving? Can you see some tangible improvements in that sense?
Miguel, I think the key thing is that people are being more mindful of what they know, and equally as much what they don't know. Sadly, what they don't know outweighs what they know, and we're challenging them to understand some of the deficiencies that exist in their industry, in their boards, in their staffing, how they market their destinations. Simply because if you really want to be a part of the current way in which destinations promote themselves, you've got to really pay attention to things that perhaps you haven't before. And I think the key thing with this conversation, Tourism Diversity Matters, Black Lives Matter, is to recognize the fact that this is not just something that the Black community in Washington, D.C. or the United States is focusing on. These are American issues, and it's more than, so it's not just about the Black community. But as we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's such a different and unique conversation than DEI, simply because of the history that America has with the Black community here. So yeah, we're seeing organizations ask more questions. They're being more purposeful. The purpose of Tourism Diversity Matters is to help those organizations that mean well or think they are on the right track, or perhaps not even aware of the fact that they're not paying attention to what's happening with the reckoning tied to this particular subject, and make sure that they make this a priority, because they're going to lose out in the long run if they don't.
I think that's really interesting. Can you maybe elaborate on some of the, like, in practical terms, what are some of the biggest opportunities for these organizations to make, like, material changes? Like, how could they put into practice some of the advice that would be conferred?
Yeah, absolutely. It starts with your staff and looking at the dynamics of the team that you have hired. If you don't see the diversity there, it's a problem. If your team is, if you have, you referenced in the beginning that I'm one of really 9 CEOs that run destination management organizations in the US, and there are well over 700 in the US. That's a problem. And but not only is it a problem from the standpoint that we are truly a minority, but it's also from the standpoint of the opportunity to move up within the industry, which exists. So it's really more of an opportunity for us to educate and elevate their sense of awareness. People are not interested, or perhaps they show less interest on things that are not specifically affecting them. What they're not realizing is that not focusing on diversity, not having an understanding as to what needs to happen within your organization, be it the LGBTQ community, the Native American, the Asian community, what's been happening within the Asian community in the last 18 months in the United States. How are you addressing this with your team? How does your board of directors look as we talk about diversity? If it's not a diverse board, then there's probably not going to be a diverse level of ideas coming from that board of directors. How does your marketing look? Who's impacting how you market your product or your destination? Because what's happening is that if you don't have that diversity, I always focus on the 60s, where there were tons of men in advertising roles making decisions as to products for women. And how short-sighted was it for a bunch of men to sit around and talk about these products and put out these ads? And arguably for the time, it was successful because women had no option. But today, if you're that short-sighted, then you're going to lose out in the long run. And if you don't have that diversity at the table, assisting you and paying it and looking at your marketing, looking at your advertising, looking at your team as a whole, then arguably you're not going to be as successful. And the last thing is, there has been, data has proven, and there's studies that show that diverse organizations are more effective, they're more profitable, the employees are happier. So our job and our role is to educate and to elevate their sense of why this is important, because otherwise people will think that we're not talking about them, which is usually the case. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice.
I wonder if you could say something about what events can do. Everybody organizing an event, and particularly bringing events to a place like DC. Is there something that, are there messages that can help? Are there ways that they can educate people through events that can really help this in a more kind of wider perspective?
Well, I think that, and you mentioned DC, DC is a diverse town. It was for a long time largely large Black population more than any other. That it's more diverse today. But even as you look at the Black population here, we're not all Black people from America. We're Black people that have migrated from all over the world that live in DC, which represents diversity within itself. So we're going to share and showcase DC through that perspective to groups that are looking at coming into the city. We're going to share with them, one of the biggest misnomers that's tied to a population visiting is that when the Chinese visit Washington, they want to go to Chinese restaurants. And I guarantee you, although they probably want to see how the Chinese community is represented in Washington, D.C., it's not top of mind to eat Chinese food while they're in America. It's top of mind to have the American experience. Are groups thinking along those lines? Are our members thinking along those lines as we go about promoting our destination? So we advocate and help groups to understand what we have to offer as a destination, and also to understand, especially with the international community coming for conventions, their interest in the African American Museum of History and Culture, which is the latest Smithsonian, is not tied to the color of their skin per se. It's, because in America, they think that these things are built for the Black community versus recognizing that they're built to educate everyone. I'm not saying all of America is like that, but that's more a common thread than anything else. Whereas international communities come in because they want to learn more about the African American experience or the Holocaust or other things, and how we position those unfortunate things that have happened in history through our culture and through our museums. So it's our goal to educate those that are looking at bringing events to the city as to how to successfully have events and do meetings in Washington.
And I imagine that is something that comes through in the marketing that you do and the actions that you do. Is DEI always top of mind in those actions that you take?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's funny you should ask that. At the end of, or early in 2020, we have an amazing campaign that represents the diversity of Washington, D.C. And there was, everyone's on lockdown. Everyone's got plenty of time. And there was a Washingtonian that lives in Texas that looked at an ad that showed a Latino, a Asian woman, and a white woman, and it talked about Experience the Real DC. But what they did not see is the entire series of the ads that also represented other cultural groups. And so that created a chat that, because everybody's at home, it spiraled into this big conversation about how we're not doing enough to promote DC's diversity. And then, of course, when we showed them the whole spectrum of the advertising campaign, they said, okay, I get it now. Oops, we jumped the gun. So, and it didn't mean that we dismissed that person's sense of understanding of what we're trying to do. It was an opportunity for us to educate them, but also an opportunity for us to say, okay, well, what can we do differently? And in some cases, there's nothing we can do differently because we're not, we are promoting all aspects of this destination. And this happens to be a very international destination, and we're proud of that. And it's not about diluting the fact that for a long time, and even today, DC has been known as Chocolate City because of the large Black population here.
Very interesting. I wanted to change the conversation a little bit and kind of start wrapping up. I want to talk about young leaders and how do we get young leaders to kind of get involved in the industry. The industry has suffered quite a bit of brain drain in the last 18 months or so. A lot of people sadly have left the industry. So I think it's really important that we start to get fresh blood in the industry to get people excited about the industry again. Do you have any advice on what we could do as an industry and in our own kind of roles?
I think, and I think about this all the time because I realized that when I entered this industry 32 years ago, we had an image problem. The perception that I had of a convention and visitors bureau or hospitality was working in a hotel or working in a restaurant. And although there's nothing wrong with either of them, I didn't want to do either. But even beyond that, I didn't want to be a bellman. I didn't want to be a server in a restaurant. And those are admirable jobs, but that's the perception of the industry. So it starts with us really focusing on how diverse the opportunities are in hospitality. On the outside looking in, no one really knows what the DMO does. And I know that. And even within hospitality, there are certain, when I talk to schools of hospitality, it's not on the radar of 90+% of those that are in those classes. So it's really tied to getting folks, the younger generation, to understand how diverse the industry is. It's also tied to getting them to understand that there is a lot of diversity within the industry. Unfortunately, if you're looking at a pyramid, it's at the lower level, and there are opportunities to elevate that and to move the needle in a positive direction. Because what normally happens is that those that started off in the industry are not in the industry 5 years later because they didn't see the opportunities. So we've got to focus on that as well. Get them to understand and make sure that companies understand what we were just talking about, the importance of having a diverse team, and making sure that folks see opportunities to remain engaged and involved within the hospitality industry. And I think those are steps that are important to take so that folks will understand that you can be an interior designer, an architect, a landscape architect. There's so many different careers that are tied specifically to hospitality, and we just have to work on making sure that the younger leaders understand how dynamic this industry is as a whole.
Really interesting. It does sound like the industry has a bit of an image problem, and we need to kind of explain what it is and the possibilities that there are within the industry, and then hopefully we can have a more diverse but also a more inspired workforce and young leaders coming in.
Absolutely.
I wonder if
if I were to ask my family, I'm sorry, I always joke, if I ask my mom today, ask my mom what I do, she'll say he does something in tourism, and years and years later. But there's always, everyone wants your kid to be a doctor or a lawyer. They can define what those roles are, but hospitality is a little bit more ambiguous. And so we joke about it, but we also recognize that it's a problem.
Yeah, I think it's certainly true. Parents always want their kids to have archetypal jobs.
Yep.
My dad always tells his friends similarly that I do something on computers. So it's very much that kind of scenario, I think, for a lot of different industries that don't have an immediate point to kind of reference. Yep. I wonder if a good way to kind of combat that would be to target diversity within sourcing apparatuses, and in doing so kind of communicate the value of the job and the scope of the job and the different tiers within a job within hospitality. So for example, by posting ads that are quite descriptive for jobs in job boards and historically Black colleges or something like that, to kind of put it in front of people. It's sort of a fundamental marketing principle. You find the audience where they are already, and then you put the information where they are.
That is Dylan, a very good point. And there have been levels of success in doing that, but it also has to be tied to making sure that women see women in higher positions, and Asians see Asians in higher positions within the industry, because that really helps them to understand and it opens their perspective, it expands their perspective as to the opportunities in particular fields. So by all means, you have to be at these universities, but if I'm at the university and I say, hey, there are some great opportunities within hospitality, and there's not someone there to expand upon it and expound upon what those opportunities are and share their experiences, it's not going to be enough. Because again, the perception is, yeah, I don't want to work in a hotel that's open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. That's not for me, because they're not thinking along the lines of other positions within that hotel that are not even on their radar. So anything and everything, but really focusing on the industry through a different lens is probably equally as helpful.
I think that makes sense.
It sounds like you want to shift the narrative from a sort of exploitation narrative to an opportunity narrative. And you need leaders, you need people to show the possibilities that look like the people that are looking for those jobs. And I think that's super important.
That is exactly right. Even IT, as we were talking about earlier, and you name it, every position in between, kids that are in school for accounting, there are great career fields and roles in companies that own hotels, but usually they think that Marriott owns all Marriott hotels. I'm like, no, they own probably less than 5% of the hotels that have their names. So that lesson expands their horizons as to what opportunities exist that are not even on their radar.
Very interesting. Well, Elliot, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really nice to talk to you and really inspiring. I think your advice is always welcome. I wanted to end with the question we ask all our guests, which is, can you recommend someone that we should have on the Event Manager podcast who can maybe expand on this topic or any other topic that you think would be important for the audience?
You know what? There's a gentleman that represents the city of Lexington, Kentucky. His name is Gathan Borden. He's a marketing guy, but he represents a DMO, and I would encourage you all to reach out to him. The spelling of his name is Gathan Borden, Borden.
Okay,
great recommendation. Yep. No, I think it'll be great to reach out, and we're trying to connect all the podcast guests so that we can have a bit of a circle of influence and kind of connecting in that way. I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us, Elliot. Thank you, everybody who's listening. On behalf of EventMB, this has been the Event Manager podcast.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Event Manager podcast. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. For the latest news and the best articles on technology and innovation in the event industry, head over to eventmb.com.